Hi, and welcome to my podcast. My name's Davismoon, and I'm studying a PhD at Liverpool Hope University Creative Campus. My PhD is in Neurodiversity and learning through the creative and performing arts. I mean, it's very close to me because I'm also ADHD. You can tell by my hands and the way I keep moving around. But yeah, it's very close to my heart, this PhD. So today I've got two wonderful people that are specialists in this kind of field as well. And I have a good understanding. I hope today's podcast we can explore a lot around how ADHD affects young people or people in general, but also look at how creative performing arts kind of can combat some of those elements that we find maybe difficult in terms of learning and circumnavigating life. So we've got Mr. Tony Lloyd from the ADHD Foundation. Mr. Tony, do you want to say hello?
Hello, everybody.
And Miss Nanette Mellor.
Ms.
Ms. Nanette Mellor.
Doctor.
Doctor.
Archbishop Nanette Mellor.
I'm liking that it's nice and informal and we're relaxed because I like conversations where it's just kind of natural. So I'm going to kick off by just saying a bit, maybe talking about myself first, and then if we can all just say what our expert feels in. So I grew up in London. I'm from Caribbean descent. I grew up in North London, Tufnell Park, and I struggled at school when I was younger. And I think it's a good part to start why I'm where I am right now is through my experience at school where I didn't fit in. I found it hard to concentrate at school, and I think a lot of the teachers that I interacted with thought I was disruptive, a troublemaker. I was different, and I didn't know why. I couldn't put my finger on the pulse, but I would stand against the teachers. I would swear at them, and if I didn't enjoy a class, I'd walk out, or I would smash things, or I'd break things, or I'd make it impossible for the teacher to teach a class. I didn't understand at the time why I was doing that and why I was disruptive. But then as I hit 13, 14, I found like dancing and singing and drama. My school in London was one of the first schools that started creative performing arts in the school. I think they had a high intake of Caribbean young kids as well. And so that was, I think they realised we liked dancing and singing and drama. So I think for that school, I think they wanted to put something on the curriculum that would engage with us as well at that time. I think that was at the Windrush. So in the 60s, there was a huge influx of Caribbean kids. So I found that I took to dancing and singing and drama like that. And so at 13, 14, that definitely gave me a focus where I was failing at school. And at that time, I didn't realise about the ADHD or all of these other things of why I wasn't learning through certain formats and why I couldn't sit still in a classroom. So yeah, I excelled in dancing, and then my teacher set up a place called the Weekend Arts College where they wanted to focus more on kids that wanted to learn or progress in their vocation through performing arts, but schools weren't delivering that. So on Saturday and Sundays, we'd go every Saturday and Sundays to take part in dance classes, singing classes, drama classes, to bring us up to a standard where we could then interview or audition for the top schools and conservatoires in London or across England. So luckily, through going to Weekend Arts College, I got into Laban, to Central School of Speech and Drama. So I mean, that element of just doing performing arts really helped me with my path of becoming a performer. So jump forward like 20 odd years, I started a Weekend Arts College in Liverpool, which ran for about 18 years. And again, I found that I was working with young kids that were from deprived backgrounds, struggling at schools. I could mention some schools like Everton Free School, Harmonised Free Schools. So all these schools had lots of kids that were failed at mainstream school, but were going to a school like an academy and learning through, as I said, dance, drama, singing, art, lot of creative ways of learning. Again, I still haven't put two together about, is there a connection between young kids who maybe have neurodiverse ways of learning and performing arts, and should there be maybe more investigation or into that kind of field of teaching. So I bumped into Mr. Stephen Davismoon, who's going to join us hopefully in half an hour, who's the Dean of Liverpool Hope University, and he came to see me at my last place of work and was astounded by the work I was doing with especially young kids that were ADHD or neurodiverse with the performing arts. And he said, have you never considered doing a PhD around that whole field of work, because it seems that you have a vast knowledge of the work that you delivered over the years and how it impacts and how it works with those young kids. And so that was the kickstart to doing a PhD in neurodiversity. I never thought I would be here doing a PhD, but it makes sense. I hope I can do it justice. I think I've got a lot of experience in the field of work, and I think I'm good at bringing people together to talk about the subject matter. Hence why I'm here today with Nanette and Tony. So I've waffled on a bit about myself and hopefully giving you a bit of an outline of what I do. So today is going to be a podcast, and we're just going to talk about neurodiversity in the arts. So first of all, Nanette, Mellor, can you tell people watching at home on social networks who you are and a bit about just you in general?
Me in general, okay. So I was born in Crewe.
Crewe?
Yeah, which is nowhere near as glamorous as Liverpool, where we are today. Single mum brought us up. Did very well at school, worked very, very hard at school, loved science, loved the arts. Masked my dyslexia brilliantly. Nobody had a clue. I was diagnosed when I was in the third year of my degree. And that was because I'd gone to student support services to see if I could get my grades up, because they were coming in at a kind of borderline first, 2-1 to first all the time. So I went to student services and I said, I really need to bump stuff up, bump my points up just a little bit. And they gave me some tests and gave me exam condition tests, and I went through them, and they were just like, look at all of these spelling mistakes. And I was
so dyslexia,
yeah.
Just for people, just a quick brief of what dyslexia is.
Well, it's an umbrella term, like a lot of these terms are. So it's a term that the scientists, the researchers have come up with to kind of categorise people like me who find decoding language quite difficult.
Yeah.
So for me, it's about spelling. And it affects me in other ways as well. So left and right's always really difficult for me to work out. I don't know why. I have difficulty picking up some types of information quickly, so it takes me a bit longer. But I don't really look at it that way. I look at it a slightly different way. So for me, I think the reason I have trouble decoding things like language is because my brain is doing something else at that time. And so I think really I haven't got a deficit. I've just got a different type of brain. My brain works very, very differently than somebody who hasn't got dyslexia. That's not a bad thing.
No, not at all.
So got my degree and then was going to, I think one important story, I guess, is that my first love is music and always was, and I loved creating music. As a child, I had one of these Major Morgans with the little pads on.
Oh.
I had a recorder, little xylophone, all of that. And everyone said, Nanette's good at music, Nanette's going to be a musician. And I still love music now, but I stopped doing music at school because the route into music, the progression route into music at my school was to join the brass band. And I joined the brass band. Even though I was a punk, I was still determined to do music. So I was like, fine, I'll join the brass band. But got asked to leave after a few months because I couldn't sight read the music. and it was just
Okay.
impossible for me to do that. So I just sort of went, oh, well, I can't do music. I'm not very good at music, so I'll do visual arts and drama and things like that instead. And love science, love psychology. So did a mixture of things at university. Did a combined honours degree in the arts and neurobiology, neuropsychology. Really.
With dyslexia?
Yeah.
Wow.
And to be honest, it kind of, it still frustrates me now that when I look back at university and one of the reasons I studied art is because I love painting and I'm good at painting. And why on earth why did I have to do all these bloody written exams? I still don't understand it, because they don't ask people who study English literature to paint, do they? Do you know what I mean?
I totally
don't get
that.
it. And I as far as I'm concerned, way back when someone came up with this weird code to enable us to communicate with each other, and not very well, and now I'm forced to use it every day.
Do you know, you just touched on, because I think the old way of learning, as you just mentioned, all this sitting down and writing some things that you probably never use unless it's for certain types of people.
Yeah.
And I think I've mentioned it to you and to Tony about the paradigm of changing the way we need to learn. I think that's key.
And we are, and look at us today. We're doing, and people like me will listen to this, because I love podcasts, and that's how I learn now. When I'm on the tube, when I'm doing the cleaning at home, I listen to podcasts.
So we're doing a podcast.
Yeah.
And now on Nanette's left, should I say your right, is Mr. Tony Lloyd from the ADHD Foundation. Tony, do you want to give us a little insight on you and what you...
Some interesting parallels with Nanette, really. I'm ADHD and I have something called Erlin's, which means sometimes I get letters mixed up, but it's not the same as dyslexia quite. But I'd really like to concur with what Nanette said. Dyslexic brains have been around for as long as human beings have. Yeah. The written narrative word has only been around for about 5,000 years. So, context is often what disables people. And I'd love to know why our Department for Education insists that even if you're studying music or geography, that you will always be marked on your spelling and grammar, because everything is always reduced to your ability to represent your intelligence in the written word. And maybe 50 years ago, before computers, it mattered a great deal more. But now that we've all got computers and we've got spell check and grammar check and everything else, then I don't see why we make young people and young adults sit and do handwritten 3-hour exams. I think it's archaic. It's like making people sit on their left hand instead of writing with their left hand, because some idiot somewhere decided that everybody had to write with their right hand, because we used to make left-handed children do that. For me, I was a bright kid, I was an academically gifted kid, I was a nice kid, I was a popular kid, but I came from a family with a dad who worked away and a mum who had some problems, so it had its bit of trauma. But, of course, nobody would have ever thought that I had ADHD, because I was a bright kid, and bright kids don't have ADHD, apparently. And because I was a nice kid, well, couldn't be ADHD because nice kids don't get it. And you know the rest of the story. So it took me, I think, until I was 29 for the penny to drop with me, because I was reading a lot of the research that was coming out of Stanford. And, of course, I'd been to university, I'd done philosophy, and... I found myself working at Otis Elevators because it was the 80s and there wasn't really an awful lot going on. And I thought, I'm going to go into mental health. My first love was always psychology. So I went back to university and did a couple of master's degrees and then a doctorate. I knew that I learned differently. And I knew by that stage I probably had ADHD. But again, when I found out about my ADHD in the early 90s, you couldn't get a diagnosis as an adult, because apparently in our medical profession it was something that you grew out of on your 16th birthday.
You were saying that earlier, 16.
And again, I looked at the NHS website page and it said people with ADHD, they fidget, they're hyperactive, they're inattentive, and they are more likely to take drugs and become alcoholics and commit crime. And you just think, oh, God, horrific. That's not really my understanding of myself. But I read a lot of the really good stuff, and Nanette probably would have been all the stuff that was coming out of Harvard and Stanford in the 90s around positive psychology, positive psychiatry, and it just completely reframed everything for me. And I thought, right, okay. Studying has always been hard for me. I would get great grades in lesson and essays, but exams were a nightmare for me. But I learned how to play to my cognitive strengths, and I learned how to learn in a way that worked for me. And eventually, when you could get a formal diagnosis as an adult in the ADHD in the UK,
away.
I got that, and I started taking meds, and it made life a lot easier for me. It's just during the day at work, really.
We talked about focus.
Particularly, and Nanette will know this, as a CEO, you have to deal with a lot of open loops, and you have to spin a lot of plates. And I used to think, God, this is why have I done this with ADHD? But then the research that's come out has told us that over 30% of employers, entrepreneurs, senior executives that have either ADHD or dyslexia or both, university graduates, twice as likely to start their own business. I think, is it 70% of all marketeers have ADHD? It's the latest piece of research that's come out. Yeah. And 40% of all millionaires identify as dyslexic. So
I heard that.
Somebody needs to tell somebody in our Department for Education and in Ofsted that this idea that neurodiverse or neurodivergent, depending on which word you prefer, students are somehow less able or less intelligent or have a lower IQ, need to do something about it. And maybe they might say, well, we don't say that, but the reality is that the vast majority of young people with any kind of different mind, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism, is that they significantly underachieve in education, and that has significant implications for their life chance trajectories, their employability, their economic independence, their ability to be active citizens, and also gives them multiple and cumulative disadvantage as a result of unemployment or poverty, low socioeconomic sort of circumstances. So all the research that's coming out now is great because it's one in the eye for the diehards.
but they've been failed a lot. I was nearly failed, and I think this is why I think this podcast would be really great to explore that. Tony, can you tell us a bit about the ADHD Foundation and its role as an organisation?
Like the Brain Charity, we don't just work with ADHD, we work with the whole range. We always have, because they all overlap and they all co-occur. So, for example, there's research that says 60% of people with autism also have ADHD. Yeah. But you never read about that on any of the autism charity websites. People with ADHD, 40% of people with ADHD also have dyslexia. And the co-occurrence with dyspraxia and dyscalculia, and these are arbitrary kind of lines that were set mostly with samples of male boys, weren't they? So there's a massive gender bias. We overlook 75% of all girls who are ND. I use the word ND, not neurodivergent or neurodiverse, because I don't like to identify somebody who's deviant from the norm or divergent from the norm. I think neurodiversity is the norm. There isn't a single person on this planet that looks the same or sounds the same out of 7.5 billion people, and actually out of 7.5 billion people, everybody's brain is as unique as their fingerprint. So no such thing as a norm, but I think historically within a medical paradigm, anybody who was on the edges of a standard distribution curve was classed as either abnormal or disordered.
I hate that word.
And of course it's kind of it's still there, and I think it strips people of dignity and demeans them and defines them by deficit rather than by talent
Your
and
good
potential.
friend mentioned that, Roy Bremner, the two words in ADHD, deficit, which he frowned upon, and disorder. And that really resonated with me when he highlighted those two words and how it's used in ADHD, because we haven't got a deficit.
Deficit is completely misrepresented.
Thank you.
It's actually a surplus. It's an inability to filter out. It isn't like watching 6 televisions at once. Wanting to watch one programme, but you can't focus on that because the other 5 are playing 5 other different channels, and that's really, it's about that ability to filter out other environmental stimulus.
But to use the word deficit, it really is putting a negative onto it, and then a disorder. And I'm thinking, of course, that's why kids, when you mention the kid, oh, he's got ADHD. Oh, yeah, then he's got an issue. Well, it shouldn't be. And I think I think it's when I met you that I heard first the word neurodivergent and I thought that's a much more resonant way of speaking about the way I live my life is just neurodivergent.
I mean, I prefer neurodiverse rather than neurodivergent. I know neurodivergence is what it currently says in the dictionary, but then, look at some of the words we've used to describe people who are different in the dictionary, whether they be people of colour, even people who have physical challenge. We used to call them invalids, didn't we? Invalid.
Invalid.
And I always use the point that because the root of the word neurodivergent it means to deviate from the norm. Well, for me, diversity of mind is the norm. That is the universal design. Why have 7.5 billion people all got different brains? And the reason for that is that there must be an evolutionary purpose. And there must be an evolutionary purpose why 1 in 10 people have dyslexia, 1 in 20 ADHD, 1 in 20 dyscalculia, 1 in 10, dyspraxia, 1 in 60 autistic. That is the norm. That diversity of mind is the norm. And the sum is greater than the parts.
Anyone watching back, on YouTube or listening to this podcast, you come up with all these names, and I struggle sometimes like what's the word you just mentioned?
Dyscalculia.
Yeah, so I think it'd be really great just to look at that and break down as your expertise what those mean. So someone who has
dyscalculia.
What does that mean for anyone?
Again, an umbrella term. And it is, again, if you try to, like Tony said, put it into context, what this is about is that it is a group of people that struggle with the kind of structures, systems, patterns that exist within our society at the moment. So when you talk about dyslexia, you're talking about letters and
numbers.
I can't say
Which
that.
I was saying to you as well, I remember.
Numbers.
Yeah.
But again, it's just a way of us trying to describe how kind of describe the different problems that people have. But what we don't do is we don't describe the positive aspects. So for me, dyslexia, dys means without in Latin, and so the emphasis is on what I can't do, not what I can do. And so I think that all of these terms need to be renamed with a much more open mind. I find it quite difficult to sit here and talk to you about these conditions without talking about what the problems are that those individuals have. But actually, there needs to be a lot more research on the upside of what's happening, because, to my mind, most a brain will have a particular interest. It will be focused on particular things,
of course.
And I think that's all we're describing, really, when we talk about these different, subsets of brains. So they're the ones over here that like doing stuff like that, and then the ones over there that like doing stuff like that.
Like this. And that's all it is, really.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, as you're saying. And we're not,
I've got a really good example. When I was on, I went on some Excel training recently. Now, this isn't something I would ordinarily sign up for, because I have no interest in Excel. But I thought, well, in order to make best use of this piece of kit for the Brain Charities team, I need to understand what it's capable of. So I went on this 3-day training, Excel, 3 days of Excel, right? So as you can imagine, my mind started to wander in a few of these sessions. And there was one particular point where the tutor was talking about Excel, an Excel functionality within Excel, which enabled you to set targets for things. And he said, "Can you put your hand up if you've used this bit, this button in Excel?" And the 3 people in the room that put their hand up were all people from the private sector. And I noticed that earlier on in the training, they had all put their hand up when it came to a conversation about competition and kind of being able to use Excel to work out your competition, who's in competition with you. And so that got me thinking then about competitiveness, the private sector and targets, and whether people in the private sector are naturally more competitive, whether they were much more inclined to set targets for themselves. But of course, while I was having that thought, I completely missed what the guy was talking about, and that button. I totally missed, and I still don't know, and I'll never know what that button can do on Excel, because my brain doesn't think that way. I've got dyslexia, and I'm a big picture thinker.
Did you learn anything then from the 3 days?
Yeah, I learned about what it's capable of, but I didn't learn how to use it. I can't. My brain's just not bloody interested.
Maybe you learn, as I said, someone needs to sit down and actually show me one-on-one. I don't learn really well in a group.
Other people can do that. Other people can do it. And they can do it far much better. They'll be brilliant at it. Yeah. I can't do it. My brain doesn't want to do it. My brain wants to do it.
Thank you. Being forced to do things. I'm glad you just mentioned that. If your brain doesn't want to do it, why are you forcing kids in a school environment to force them to learn in a specific way? I just don't get it, and I never have done.
I think it boils. I mean, there's a few points here, isn't there? The first one is we know that with dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, autism, it's the way the brain processes information that's different, and there are some parts of my brain that make me exceptionally good at some things, and then there are other parts of my brain that make me exceptionally poor at some things. But the reality is that's the universal design, that we have this diversity of human neurocognitive capability, and you could sum that up in it is about differences in neurocognitive capability. I think the problem arises because when this great idea came about that we were going to educate everybody and we were going to let children go to school and learn, somebody decided that everybody had the same brain and everybody had to learn the same way, and you all had to write with your right hand, and you all had to have a fantastic memory, and you all had to sit there while we gave you all of this knowledge, and then we tested your memory on it at the end of the academic year.
That's the Industrial Revolution.
Here's the question. What do we mean by intelligence? Is it the same as intellect? Is it the same as knowledge? Can we measure that in a handwritten exam? And it brings into question, what is the point of education? Because I think, and it's a broader conversation. I think for the 21st century, the world is changing. We are the most successful species on this planet because we are so adaptive.
Yeah,
we have adapted to our environment, and we've been able to adapt ourselves from an evolutionary perspective in order to be able to fit into our environment as well. But the world is changing so quickly now. Culture, the workplace, the kind of jobs that exist now are radically different from what they were 40 years ago. The kind of skills and competencies that employers want are quite different, I think, from a lot of what we're teaching in school. I left school, I think, having significantly underachieved. My mental health was not great. I spent most of my last year at school off in hospital. And I remember asking myself, what would school have done for me? Or what could have school done for me? And yes, you've got to have a broad-based education. Yes, you've got to know a little bit about geography, history, and everything else in order to find out what it is that really interests you. But I thought the things I really needed to learn, like how to have self-confidence, how to have self-esteem, how to play to my strengths, how to apply knowledge, how to use my intellect, and how my life experience and my hindsight and my foresight and all of those things that really are what constitute intelligence, which is not really what we measured in a 3-hour handwritten exam in school. How to be a parent, how to be a decent, kind human being, how to, deal with pressures and stress and things, all of the things that I really needed, I wasn't taught at school. And most of what I learned and whatever success I had afterwards came about in other ways. So I think the question about, what is the purpose of education? I think, does it prepare young people to transition to adulthood? And Nanette, do you think it prepares young people for the world of work? Does it prepare young people for parenting and citizenship.
No, it doesn't. I mean, it's a lot better, I think, when I was
Yeah.
at school, because I am so much younger than you, Tony. So when I was at school,
Oh,
things were better.
thanks.
I love it.
I think that there was a bit more emphasis on citizenship, and I know there is even more emphasis on that now. But I completely agree with you. Nobody. Well, there's so many different factors. There's socio-economic factors as well, of course, behind schooling, which are really, really important. But I wish somebody would have identified me as being dyslexic, and I wish they'd have said to me, this means that you think in this way, and that means
Absolutely.
that you can do these things.
Yeah.
And it's really simple, isn't it?
Yeah.
And
But-
it's the same with, all of the other different neuro, with neurodiversity, I think you have to accept different children learn in different ways.
Different ways.
You need
absolutely.
to teach them in different ways, and they may well end up going into different types of roles because of that. And I think, it's difficult for us to think about that in current times because we are so focused on inclusion. And of course, as soon as you start saying there are groups of children here who learn differently,
Yeah.
really,
It's all the resources as well to try and provide that. But Tony, and I'm glad you mentioned that. Tony, you mentioned about, and this resonated with me about the dopamine levels when we're learning and when you're excited and they're fired off.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself when you said that about certain classes, certain teachers, when my dopamine levels were firing off and I started to enjoy a class. You mentioned, why do you think that's so important when a child is learning?
Well, there are 4 major neurotransmitters in the brain, and dopamine plays a key role in learning, memory, motivation. That's a grossly oversimplistic description of what dopamine does. But when the body needs to produce, this is why kids with ADHD fidget, and some adults. The body's natural way of producing more dopamine is to move. That's why they fidget. So I spent my whole of my primary school getting hit with a table tennis bat by the teacher for fidgeting. And he didn't understand that my natural instinct was to try and concentrate. I needed to move. Now, all children learn and focus better when there is structured, managed movement within any lesson design and delivery.
Okay.
But we produce dopamine. It's a feel-good hormone. It's a reward hormone. So when you do exercise, you produce a lot of dopamine, which is why a lot of professional athletes don't realise they've got ADHD until their professional careers are over.
And dancers.
And dancers.
You produce dopamine when you eat food, which is why we know that obesity is a problem in people who don't know they've got ADHD, particularly girls, because the manifestation of ADHD is slightly different than females. And you get a rush of dopamine when you learn something new that is interesting and relevant to you. So when I go to a new city, I automatically feel good because I'm in this new place and I'm seeing all these novel things. There is this strong link between creativity. I think the hard quantitative evidence isn't there yet, but the theory is that people will get a dopamine rush when they create something. That it is almost a compulsion of any artist or creative person to want to create, because in the process of doing, their brain rewards them with this rush of dopamine. And, a good example, in the history curriculum would be Leonardo da Vinci, who had ADHD and dyslexia, but was a scientist, an inventor, an artist. I mean, he was a creative, a polymath in so many different ways. So there is this idea that for a lot of people who work in the arts and creative industries, and there are creative jobs in every industry, depending on what role you're in a big company. There is this kind of dopamine rush. The problem with that is, though, that sometimes that dopamine rush can be an addiction. So food can be an addiction, exercise can be an addiction, and for me, music particularly was an addiction, because I think throughout my childhood, things at home weren't great. I self-medicated with music. It gave me a dopamine rush. I would spend hours on end of a night with headphones on, just listening to music, and I kind of...
Can I ask what you're into, Tony? What you're into?
Really eclectic.
Oh, is it?
Yeah, really eclectic.
I have as well, a variety of different music.
Yeah, really eclectic. everything from classical to house music.
So we're going to go to some questions. I just want to touch on, and thanks for joining us, Mr. Stephen Davismoon.